Reformed Church.
There's a verse in, Jesus says this in I think a couple of the Gospels, when he says that don't fear man that can only kill the body, right? But God, who can throw both soul and body into hell, right? And people quote that almost like, I don't know, like, what's the big deal? All they can do is kill you. And you're like, that doesn't calm a whole lot of fears in a lot of people, because like, well, what can man do to me? And then you read that, what can man do to me? And like, well, Jesus said they can kill me. So I'm like, oh, well, that's not exactly casting out any fear in me. In fact, that like we take that almost like Jesus saying that that's what we're vulnerable to. But Jesus saying this in a theoretical sense, because he's speaking to believers at the time, and he says that basically the worst that a man can do in general, not saying that you're not redeemed from it, and I'll prove that to you right now, but not saying you're not redeemed from it, the worst that a man can do to someone else is kill the body. And he's saying the Lord has power to kill both soul and body in hell. Now, you know it's theoretical that he's putting these theoretical things out there, because he's talking to believers, and God doesn't throw any believer's soul and body into hell, and yet he's saying that also, side by side with saying the worst that a man can do is kill the body, but God can kill both soul and body by casting into hell. Neither of those things he's saying is something that has to happen to you, especially the latter. Every Christian knows that. He's talking to believers, and when he says that the Lord can throw soul and body into hell, is that something that he's saying is applicable to you? No, but he uses that as an example, saying, well, God can do much worse to a man than a man can do to another man. So he's saying if you want to respect anybody's word just based off the consequences, you'd be better off listening to me. So he says that. But this specific verse is sort of a counterpart to what Jesus is saying, right? Because Jesus talks about what the worst that a man can do to another person, right? And he's just speaking generally and theoretically there about what a person can do to another person. Because it's interesting, when he says here, in God have I put my trust, I will not be afraid. I will not be afraid what man can do unto me. If you're thinking, well, they can kill me. Well, actually, no, that's not the will of God for you. If you keep reading, when the psalmist says here, he's essentially asking, what can man do to me? He said, I will not be afraid what man can do to me. In just the next two verses, he said, your vows are upon me, O God, I will render praise unto you, for you have delivered my soul from death, and will not deliver my feet, and wilt thou not deliver my feet from falling, that I may walk before God in the light of the living. The deliverance that Jesus provided, because just so you know, there's no deliverance. Like when you read that and say, you've delivered my soul from death, is that talking about something that Jesus provided? Well, there's only one way, right? There's only one way. So if there was only one way to your house and I showed up at your house, you would know what way I took, right? There's really only one way. So if there's really only one way to receive from God, only one way to the Father, and Romans 5:2 says that there's only one access or way into the grace of God, then when the Bible talks about some kind of deliverance, you know it was provided by Jesus because there's only one way. It's funny, right, how we think, like we wonder about those things, and then you realize such a simple principle like that fixes it. So of course that's talking about deliverance that Jesus provided. You've delivered my soul from death, and wilt not thou deliver my feet from falling, that I may walk before God in the light of the living. You know what light of the living means? It means above ground. Believe that or not. It's the opposite of shadow of death. Shadow of death, if you look at our glossary, reformedchurch.com/glossary, shadow means something that's covered up. Light means something that's exposed. So covered up, it can also mean buried. So when David says, yea, though I walk in the valley of the shadow of death, I'll fear no evil, he's not saying he's actually in the shadow of death, because that's talking about hell, or at least the underworld. It's kind of like the same psalm where David also says, if I made my bed in hell, you're with me. He's saying the same thing. He's saying, yea, though, even though I were to walk through the valley of shadow of death, I would fear no evil. In other words, I could walk through hell and not be afraid. That's all he's saying. He's not saying he's in the valley of the shadow of death, because once you know the valley even is referring to like the underworld. The base of the mountains it's called in Jonah, or the sea, or hell. Read Jonah chapter 2. He refers to the foundations of the mountains, or the sea and hell, all is the same thing. So when he says shadow of death, he's talking about, the underworld. That's what he's talking about. Again, our glossary confirms all those things. You can look up the word valley on our glossary, the word shadow on our glossary, or shade. And so when he says in the light of the living, that literally means above ground, the land of the living, light, the exposed part, not buried in the ground. And so this is talking about physical life, of course. We want to spiritualize everything, death and life, and what that means. But he says, you've delivered my soul from death. And then he says that I may walk before God in the light of the living. It's a good thing to be alive. Do you know that? It's actually a good thing. Like God deems life good and death is bad. I know that confuses Christians a little bit, but that's actually a legit point. He says that in Deuteronomy, I think it's chapter 28. He says, life and good and death and evil. meaning life is on the side of good, death is on the side of evil. And anyway, I just want to clarify that to you, because he says, he's asking, what can man do to me? I'm not going to be afraid. What can man do to me? And then you got this verse in the back of your head about Jesus saying, well, man can kill the body, and God can throw both soul and body into. He's not saying what man can do to you specifically, any more than he's saying he's going to throw you specifically, soul and body, into hell. He's just saying generally, this is what man can do, generally the worst they can do, and the worst that God can do. Neither of them is he applying them to you, saying, this is what's going to happen. Again, I'll stop here. If you were to apply that and say, no, he is saying that that's going to happen because that, just happens sometimes to Christians, that man is going to kill the body, well, you have to apply it to then what he said about himself also then, in saying that, well, then that means that every Christian, God is going to throw their soul and body into hell, which is clearly not true. He's speaking, generally speaking, the worst that a man can do and the worst that God can do. So when he says, what can man do to me? One of those things, as we believe, that a man will not be able to do to you, again, according to our faith, one of those things that a man will not be able to do to you is kill your body. The Lord delivers your soul from death. And that's why the psalmist can confidently say here, I'm not going to fear what man can do to me because you've already delivered my soul from death. You've already given me deliverance from all these things. So I can look at a man and say, what can you do to me? The Lord's my help. The Lord is my deliverer. And I've been delivered from these things. And therefore we can confidently say that without that other verse nagging in the back of our mind as to, what Jesus said in the gospel. So anyway, I just want to put that little clarification to that in closing. And anyway, we'll stop there.
We hope you enjoyed this message from Reformed Church. If you have, please share this with someone else and help us get this uncommon truth out to the world. If you'd like to support this good news, you can do so at reformedchurch.com/give. Also on our website, you can take advantage of our free messages, articles, and even full discipleship courses. Start reforming your mind now at reformedchurch.com.